Greetings, friends. My name is Jessa McLean, and I'm here to provide you with some blueprints of disruption. This weekly podcast is dedicated to amplifying the work of activists, examining power structures, and sharing the success stories from the grassroots. Through these discussions, we hope to provide folks with the tools and the inspiration they need to start to dismantle capitalism, decolonize our spaces, and bring about the political revolution that we know we need. Welcome. Can you introduce yourself to the audience, please?
Sure, yeah. My name is Tyler Shipley, and obviously author of the book Canada and the World, and some other books and articles and things. I'm a college professor here in Toronto, originally from Winnipeg, which obviously, is an interesting place to be from in terms of colonial history and colonial present. And yeah, I've been doing this work on capitalism, colonialism in Canada for many, many years. And I'm always really grateful for an opportunity to talk about it. So thanks to you guys for bringing me in, and hopefully I can add something to the discussion here today.
Oh, I'm sure you can. We have touched on Canadian imperialism, the mining industry, but never gone into detail. We've obviously hinted at some troubles within our foreign policy as well, but your book, Canada in the World, Settler Capitalism and the Colonial Imagination, it drives home the point that this history that we're currently reconciling with, that we're struggling with, but slowly coming to terms with, at least some of us, and how horrible it has been, and, that it continues. I think people would be mortified to know the details that same mindset is the basis of much of our foreign policy throughout the years, right? We typically have a very squeaky clean image, Canada. We're peacekeepers, and we don't do these things. But your book is really an eye-opener in terms of it has the receipts there. It goes through quite a bit of our history from the colonial period. Again, I feel like that's like saying COVID is over, but it goes quite early to present day, and we've not really learned from our mistakes. Well, we have learned, but to replicate it. Can you kind of tell us about that argument, without having to, give us the complete rundown, but you know what I mean?
The audiobook version here, yeah. Yeah, I mean, you actually said it well. In the same way that COVID is not over and continues to be really destructive and dangerous right now, colonialism is not over. Colonialism never stopped. It took different forms. Again, kind of like COVID, it's mutated into different forms, but nevertheless, it remains very much, I would argue, in the DNA of what Canada is, and that's kind of what I set out to do in the book, is actually make that claim. I think most people in Canada, at the very least, understand that it was founded on some pretty dark stuff, and obviously some people in Canada will accept that more than others. But this is a matter of public record that Canada is founded on violence and theft of land, one-sided and manipulative treaties, colonial occupation, the breaking of those treaties once they were signed, all of these things and much worse. And I think most people at some level will accept some part of that. But I think that even still in the 2020s in Canada, led by the voices of people like Justin Trudeau, the narrative becomes, well, that's a bad thing that happened in the past, and we're very sorry that this bad thing happened in the past. But it's time to move forward. Let's bring in some Indigenous dancers to our event, and then we can all feel good about ourselves knowing that we today respect Indigenous culture, and we don't have to worry about the bad stuff. And that's just nonsense. It's just absurd and offensive. So in the book, I kind of make the argument that colonialism has two founding dynamics. One is material, one is economic, and it is capitalism. I mean, that's fundamentally the reason Canada was created by French and later British settlers. It was created in order to establish a new place in which capitalist profits could be extracted from the land and from the labor that would be mixed with the land. I mean, this is just, I think, foundational. And I don't think anyone would really argue against it. There's really no other material compulsion
I'm sure
for
we
why.
can find someone, but let's not.
That's true. I'm sure they exist, but they'd be brazenly wrong. It's obvious that that's what's materially motivating the creators of Canada, the settlers, and especially later on in the period when it becomes Canada. And as I argue in the book, this necessarily means genocide. It necessarily means that because capitalism is a system where land is private property for the extraction of profits, and that's totally fundamentally incompatible with all of the Indigenous forms of political economy that existed here. And they were different. Different Indigenous nations were obviously very different from one another, but none of them had a economic system based on private ownership of land, where one person could own a piece of land and do anything they want on it. No Indigenous nation used that type of land tenure system. And it's you can't have both. You can't have a system of shared stewardship of land and also private ownership of land. They can't coexist. So from the standpoint of a Canada that's trying to create a capitalist system, the Indigenous systems have to be destroyed. That is, by definition, genocide. Whether it entails killing people, which it often did, or forcing them to assimilate into a new system, which Canada also did through the residential school system, among other things. This is genocide. So this is part of the founding of Canada. The other part, of course, is the justification for that genocide. Because, to enact something as horrific as that, you have to tell yourself a story about why it's okay. And that's what I call the colonial imagination, the set of ideas around what we might call white supremacy, which claim that European civilization was and is more advanced, more civilized, more rational, more scientific, and that it represents the future of human civilization. And so anything Europeans do in their interactions with Indigenous and colonized people around the world is justified by the claim that we are the future. White people represent the future. We are the best of what humanity has to offer. We are bringing everyone else into the light with us. And if they don't like it, if they don't accept it, well, that's their problem and they're wrong. The wise ones among them will join us. And if we have to do some violence to achieve that, then, it's for the greater good. This is the colonial imagination. And I mean, there's lots of different words we could use to describe it. I like using colonial imagination.
That's a pretty flowery term. You're pretty generous with that one.
I like it because it reminds us that this is a fantasy. It reminds us that this is not real. That at no level does any of that exist in real life beyond the imagination of the colonizers. There is no metric upon which you could ever have claimed that European civilization was more advanced in any way. Technologically, politically, economically, there's no argument that sustains it. And again, I know there are people who still to this day trot out attempts to say, no, they really were more advanced, but it falls flat. No serious historian would ever make such a claim. It cannot be upheld. It's just pure racism. So I use the term colonial imagination because I like to remind myself and my readers that this is an ideology that exists totally in the imagination of the colonizers. No one else agrees. I mean, no one else at the time agreed. A funny little side point on that. You'll sometimes hear people say, well, Johnny MacDonald, he was a racist. But hey, in those days, everyone was a racist. No, No, they weren't. No, a lot of the white people were racists, but that's not everyone. You wouldn't find very many indigenous people who would say, yeah, white civilization, it's more advanced. You wouldn't find black people saying, oh yeah, the whites, they're the best, they're the vanguard of... no one else was saying it. So all of this stuff, this white supremacist stuff, exists in the imagination of the colonizer. Those two things, the establishment of capitalism and this colonial imagination, they're at the heart of Canada's colonial relations with Indigenous people, but they persist throughout Canada's history. And in the book, I work through all of Canada's history, and I jump through different moments, whether it's Canada's invasion of El Salvador in the 1930s, Canadian support for fascism in the 30s and 40s, Canada's support for European colonial powers in the 50s and 60s, supporting the Belgians in the Congo, supporting the British in Kenya, supporting the French in Algeria or Vietnam, standing against the independence of colonized people around the world. I mean, as I say to my students, for any of my students whose parents or grandparents were born outside of Canada, there is a very, very good chance that Canada did not want their ancestors to have their own country. I mean, you put your finger on the map of the world, whether you land in, Angola, or you land in Cambodia, or you land in Brazil, you'll find Canada fighting against, materially, and in some cases physically, fighting against the independence of people in those places.
Hold on, Ted, because I think that would shock people. Like, I need that to sit with people for a little bit, because that's surely not in the history books that we are given. We know about our roles in the Great Wars, roughly. And that is it. How do they manage to do that? Like, how is that completely erased from our collective mindset? And I know you can give some modern day examples. So even when it's kind of in front of us, we aren't generally drawing these parallels like you are. And I'm sure you've got some comrades out there that have seen this and are arguing this. But most Canadians don't know any of this at all. They're very proud of their country still. And let's just separate from the complete kind of residential school denial convoy people, but most average Canadians, that want to be able to fly their flag again or whatnot. But how has that been so successful?
It's a great question. I sometimes wonder myself how it's been so effective, but I think the answer is actually embedded in that very ideology that I was describing, because it still exists. The colonial imagination is still part of, I think, Canadian culture. I think it's foundational in Canadian culture. And it's an ideology that says we know best. We are the best. We are the most advanced. We are the most civilized. In today's language, that can translate as we are the most peaceful. We are the most reasonable. We are the ones who can help mediate. We are the responsible ones. And these are the ways that Canada still frames itself. So if you grow up in the Canadian school system and in Canadian pop culture with this understanding that Canadians are good, they are reasonable, they're decent, they're well-intentioned. That's a big one. Their intentions are always good. They might make some mistakes, but their intentions are always good. This is a modern form, a modern expression of the colonial imagination, and it allows you to ignore those parts of Canadian history that do not fit that narrative, which is a lot of it. And that's the part that sometimes amazes me, because even in my lifetime, I witnessed so much of it. I was alive when Canadian peacekeepers went to Somalia and had to leave in disgrace because rather than keeping peace in Somalia, they tortured and killed for fun Somali children. And the regiment had to be disbanded. It came out that they were all incredible white supremacists. A lot of them had KKK connections and other neo-Nazi connections. I was there. I was alive. This was in the news when I was a kid. And yet it didn't pierce the armor of the story of Canadian goodness. The story was told, and Shireen H. Razak has a phenomenal book about this, and particularly about the way that that case somehow got transformed. A case that should have said to all of us, what is Canada? What is the country that produces this? But instead, the narrative that came out of that experience was Somalia is a very dark and scary place. And Somalians are dark and scary people. And our good Canadian boys, they went over there, they were good Canadian boys, but they went there and that place changed them and it brought this darkness out of them. And, they didn't have proper support. They didn't feel appreciated. Somalians didn't appreciate that they were there. And yes, they made some mistakes. But we have to appreciate the context. And it doesn't change that Canada is fundamentally good and well-intentioned all the rest of the times. So, that's how it happens. That's one case. And different versions of that get applied any and every time it becomes possible that we might have a window into what Canada really is. I mean, just a couple weeks ago, the entire Canadian Parliament stood and applauded for a guy who had been in the SS, the literal death squads of Nazi Germany. And ever since then, we have been subject to a phenomenal campaign to try to make that into an innocent mistake, a little misunderstanding. That's, I think, how it happens. That's how the story of Canadian goodness is perpetuated, because we are all primed to believe it. We want to believe it. In fact, a lot of us who grew up here, it becomes part of our identity. And people don't want their identity disrupted. They don't want their ideology disrupted. They want to keep flying the flag in the front of their house. And so it's like people are looking for the explanation that can justify this isolated bad thing Canada did. They do not want to know that it is not isolated, that it is part of a system, a pattern. And so I like to ruin people's day by telling them that it is, in fact, a pattern.
One thing that I find interesting is how this doesn't just apply to people who grew up in Canada, who live in Canada, but also is so deeply rooted in the way people view Canada around the world. As someone who is an immigrant, when you try and tell your family back home, like I'm from Colombia originally, things about Canada, it's met with a certain level of disbelief. Like there's this the idea that this Canada's some utopia of goodness. No, how could it be possible that Canada would ever do any of these things? And that has real consequences when we take a look, for example, one thing we've been talking a lot about lately is international students and temporary foreign workers who come to Canada with a certain expectation of their ability to find prosperity that then they can, deliver back to their families where they come from, and are met with the shock to see that reality is nowhere near what they were told. There's real consequences to that narrative. And I mean, I know a part of it comes from like the whole better than Americanism, where like when we're seen as like the good to America's bad, but I honestly don't fully understand how we're not being held more accountable by other nations who we have continuously exploited. It's a shock.
Yeah. I mean, it is.
Not just not held accountable, but I'm looking back at one of the articles you wrote. So again, you might have to reach back a little bit, but you're talking about Guatemala and a mine back in 1978. And I don't know, can you tell that story? Because in the end, after all of that, there was a bit of celebration surrounding a really dark maneuvering by Canada. Do you want to tell the story about?
That's the Inco mine, I think you're talking about.
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah. I mean, the very, very truncated version of the story is that Canada supported the well-known CIA overthrow of the Guatemalan government in 1954. And that was partly because Canadian mining companies like Falconbridge and Inco wanted to get into Guatemala and obviously, exploit the land, exploit the resources and the people, and make profits. But after the overthrow of the Guatemalan government, when Guatemalans took up arms in resistance to the dictatorship that had been imposed by the West, they set up in precisely the region that Inco wanted for the mine. And so a particularly brutal member of the Guatemalan military, Carlos Arana, who came to be known as the Butcher of Zacapa, led soldiers into that region to commit massacres in order to gain that territory so that the Guatemalan state could then give it to Inco to build a mine, which it did. And I mean, the problems surrounding that mine and its, even before it was built, I mean, there were Guatemalan researchers who published a report saying, here are all of the impacts this mine is going to have. And they were gunned down in Guatemala City on the eve of the opening of the mine so that there would be no criticism. And, the mine finally opens in, I think, 1978. O Canada is performed by the Guatemalan military band, and it's this, as you say, celebratory event. And one sort of footnote to all of that I find funny, and this might be what you were sort of thinking about, Jessa, is that there was an earthquake in Guatemala around that time, and to repair the Canadian image in Guatemala, Pierre Trudeau's government made a gift of, I don't know how much, but some amount of powdered milk. And it was supposed to be this symbol of, Canadian generosity. Well, in a time of need, Canadians are there for Guatemalans. Here, have some powdered milk. The gift was useless because most Guatemalans didn't drink milk, couldn't use it. It wasn't good. It didn't have the stomach, I don't know what stomach biome to handle it. And it wasn't even all that generous because the Canadian milk industry had a massive overstock and they were actually trying to dump it so that the value of the milk they did have would go up.
What do we got? What do we got lying around here? What do you guys looking at the couch? We got something we can wrap up and give for a gift?
Exactly.
Cringe.
So, I mean, there's one example of a way that Canada tries to launder its image, in the shadow of doing great harm, enormous harm. And Santiago, I think you're right that there are a lot of people around the world who believe the Canadian narrative. I think it's changing. I mean, it's changing slowly, but I do think it's changing. Certainly in Central America, where I've spent a fair bit of time, it's changed. More people know today than used to. And the mining industry is a big reason for that. I mean, those mines are so horrific and they've made them, they're like cartoon villains. And it has engendered so much anger. That's part of it. But I also just think that the kind of we're not as bad as America thing, it just doesn't hold as much water as it used to. And I don't think Canada sits in the shadows as much as it used to. I mean, there was some truth, not in terms of what Canada was really doing, but on the surface, it would have seemed like there was some truth to the idea that the Americans were far worse than Canada. Through the Cold War, for instance, there was a very conscious strategy between Canada and the U.S. that the U.S. would usually go out front and do the most obvious dirty work, and Canada would do a lot of the more subtle, behind-the-scenes stuff. This isn't a conspiracy theory. It was active planning. So Cuba, for instance, After the Cuban Revolution, we all know that the Americans tried to assassinate Fidel. They tried to invade the country, the Bay of Pigs, etc., etc. Canada maintained its embassy, maintained relations with Cuba. We all remember Pierre Trudeau going to Cuba, having his big, adventure there with Fidel. And we're led to think that that means Canada wasn't so bad. Canada was being more reasonable. No. This was all determined between Diefenbaker and Kennedy at the time of the revolution, and Canada maintained its embassy and its relations with Cuba in order to spy on Cuba, which it did.
I knew he was going there, and I knew I was getting really mad.
Yeah.
Damn.
Yeah, Canada spied on Cuba, provided intelligence that assisted some of the American attempts to overthrow the revolution, to destroy it, things like sadistic things like Operation Peter Pan. Canada was providing intelligence to facilitate that. And Cuba knew and busted some Canadian spies. That's one example. Vietnam is another. The Americans were the obvious aggressor in Vietnam, but Canada sat on a commission that was supposed to be sort of overseeing the peace and overseeing the negotiations between the two sides. This was the ICC, the International Commission, something. I don't know. It's in the book. Forget the name. But it was this committee that Canada was one of the 3 members of. And they were supposed to be neutral, trying to mitigate and manage and implement the agreement that had been made in Geneva with respect to the division of Vietnam. Instead, Canada used its role in the commission not only to spy on North Vietnam, but also to communicate threats from the Americans to the North Vietnamese, and to launder the image of the Vietnam War for the United Nations and the rest of the world. So, there were these ways in the Cold War that Canada did kind of mask its role in a lot of the worst things that the United States was doing. But I would say the mask is largely coming off in the last 20 years. And I think, Santiago, what you were describing is probably shifting. And there may be a generational shift. It may be that, it's younger people around the world that have a more clear-headed view now of Canada, and maybe older people that still cling to some of the old mythologies. But I do think it's changing.
I think in part the ability to disseminate information independently, repeatedly, and permanently, everything stays on the internet, is completely obviously different than the history that's been before us. Because I think you described it really well, use the analogy of not piercing the armor. Because the events that we do have a collective memory around, especially in our history, they have been woven in, right? They are part of that armor that we put around us to let us think that we're really good, right? And that's done deliberately. You talk about all kinds of statescraft through sport. But there are many, many ways. We did an episode on nationalism, how really innocuously our stories are repeated over and over again. Remembrance Day is a great day to highlight only the conflicts that we want to and completely skim over the rest. That's not so easy to do anymore. People can consistently be reminding others on a large scale as opposed to, it's just the newspaper, your history books, this outdated encyclopedia to sift through and any academic books that you can get your hands on. But, there is no erasing that. And what we do around the world can be brought back to us from a completely different perspective now. So when Santiago says, we keep going back to Santiago's comment about how we appear around the world. And when he first said that, I was like, well, sure as fuck the people in this village don't have that view anymore. And now we can hear their stories more easily, through storytellers like yourself, but also through, TikTok and see firsthand this, especially the cartoon villains you describe and the mining that goes on in South America with Indigenous peoples. And mining is one of those industries that we are so prevalent in weapons that we don't brag about. When we're showing those slideshows of Canada in the background, right, when someone's doing the anthem, and those don't, miners don't show up there, even though that's a massive industry for us. And surely there's not somebody there assembling bomb parts or whatever the
What's the percentage?
armored vehicles that we're sending to Ukraine. Like, that's not really part of our identity on purpose, even though it's a huge part of our economy.
Is it 70% of mining companies are around the world are Canadian? Something ridiculous like that, right?
It's huge.
I forget the exact number.
Yeah,
Tyler's
it's huge.
nodding.
It's huge. And it's partly because as the mining industry developed in Canada, the Canadian government basically deregulated and gave mining companies extraordinary power, much more so than in other countries. And so there are even, American mining companies that will set up in Canada and set their headquarters in Canada so that they can benefit from the extremely lax regulation of the mining industry in Canada.
Americans are coming for our lax
Yeah.
mining regulations. That's comforting.
Right? Yeah.
That's
Says a lot.
comforting. But you're right. They are getting a huge profile now. They have protests outside of their offices occasionally, and it is something that's coming more to the forefront.
Yeah, no, for sure. And I think, this is one of the ways that the mask is coming off. I think there are several. I think that Canada was, through the Cold War, because it was very consciously trying to be a behind-the-scenes member of the Imperial Club, it was able to kind of hide a little bit and get away with creating that mythology of itself as the peacekeeper, or the broker of good intentions, and so on. But I think I think it was always a bit more flimsy than we realized. I think Canadians always believed it, hook, line, and sinker, because we wanted to, of course, as I said. But people around the world actually have been very critical. And a lot of the cases I look at, when I look at specific incidents, the Cabora Bassa Dam, which was a project of Portuguese colonialism, South African apartheid, the Rhodesian state, all of the right-wing racist forces in southern Africa were sort of part of this mega project, this sort of Portuguese mega project in Mozambique. And Canada was in there like a dirty shirt with these right-wing regimes. And the Mozambican resistance very specifically named Canada, highlighted the Canadian role. And you find this when you look at these cases. I mean, I mentioned briefly the invasion of El Salvador in the 1930s. It was a Canadian company, international power based in Montreal, owned by I.W. Killam of the Killam Foundation and the Killam Scholarships and Killam Grants and all of that.
That sounds ominous.
The name is not ideal given the outcomes. I.W. Killam's company was the target of the Salvadoran protest movement that had emerged into a revolution by the early 30s, and which prompted the Salvadoran government to ask for help in crushing this rebellion, and, which led to the Canadian Navy being sent, so that in the end, 40,000 Salvadoran peasants were massacred by the Salvadoran state, with Canadian ships in the harbor watching and presiding over this, all on behalf, at least in part, of a Canadian company. And it was known to be a Canadian company. So, I mean, I think that Canada did a really good PR job for a stretch there in the middle of the Cold War. But ultimately, I think I trust the people, broadly speaking, the people of the colonized world, that instinctively they do come around to seeing reality. You're not going to go to Afghanistan and find anyone who believes that Canada is some great peacekeeper. You're not going to get that in much of the Middle East. I know in my experiences in Central America that mythology is dying. My sense is that it's starting to fall apart elsewhere too. So, yeah, I mean, I think it's an important thing to have on our agenda. It's important to have in our minds. But I do think the mask is slipping.
See, in a way, I find comfort in that because, you want people to know what's up. But although it's egregious, that subversive spying role perhaps is far less destructive than the role the Americans take. And if we're kind of, once the mask completely comes off, is there any point in spending energy being in the background, or do we then fully embrace our imperialist military role and become outward aggressors?
Yeah. And to add on to that, I mean, like, the mask is fully slipped when we talk to, like, about the United States, about France, right? They're still carrying out all of these atrocities. They're still oppressing countless nations around the world. It hasn't affected, like, their image hasn't affected their ability to do so. And I guess the question is, like, if the goal is to, change it so that we're no longer that imperial power, well, what the hell do we do if exposing it isn't going to do it?
Yeah. And I mean, I think that's a pretty important point. Like, knowing that Canada is bad may be a first step, but it's a small first step. Because fundamentally, we can talk about what's happening in Palestine right now. I think a large part of the world fully understands how bad Israel is, how incredibly over-the-top violent Israel is, the fact that they make openly genocidal remarks, that members of the government will literally call Palestinians human animals. I think a lot of people do know what's up. And yet, the state of Israel continues to exist, continues to kill people in Palestine. So I think, it's important to remember that change happens from resistance, not from awareness, right? Awareness is cheap. It takes resistance to really make change. And I think that applies to Canada too. 20 years Canada occupied Afghanistan. That's a really long time. And that, I think, for me, that's a really sort of pivotal, transformative moment in terms of Canada taking a much more active imperialist role in the world. And that's the kind of thing that the Canada of the Cold War wouldn't have done. Canada would have supported it in a range of side ways. But, not since the Korean War had Canada been so active in a colonial war as it was in Afghanistan. And it just keeps telling the same stories. It just keeps telling the same narratives. And Afghanistan was actually almost a perfect mirror of Canadian colonialism, because everything that Canadians said about Afghanistan was exactly what they had said about Indigenous peoples. There's a soldier who says, we're in a place, he's talking about Afghanistan, he says, we're in a place that's 2,000 years behind. It's like walking with people from National Geographic. Right? This is an explicit expression of the white supremacy that founded Canada, the claim that we, the white people, are the future. And all of the non-white and colonized people of the world, they are the past. They are primitive. They are backwards. They are, destined to be on the dustbin of history, while we will be the avant-garde of the future of humanity. And these are claims that Canadian soldiers made again and again and again, in different forms, in different words, right? We're here to help girls go to school. That was something that was repeated constantly during the Canadian occupation. And on the surface, that sounds like maybe a sort of a feminist thing, a good thing. In fact, it was just an expression of white supremacy. It was a claim that said Afghans don't know how to run a modern society. Afghans are so backwards that they haven't even figured out to let girls go to school. This was inaccurate because in the 1970s, Afghanistan had a robust civil society and communist movement that had pressured to change the Afghan state, and in fact had led to women being in school, being active members of society, with limitations, obviously, but a progressive path was taking place in Afghanistan, independent of any colonial occupation. That all ended, of course, when the United States backed the Mujahideen reactionary fighters to drag Afghanistan into civil war in the 80s, which then gave rise to the Taliban, which led into the invasion. And so by the time these Canadian soldiers are arriving and saying, these people don't even let girls go to school, they're just so divorced from reality. But just as when they claimed Indigenous people were backwards and primitive and savage, they were wrong. They were wrong, and they were making these claims in order to justify their own colonial occupation. They were there to justify the fact that Canadian companies, Kilo Gold Mines, Canaccord Financial, SNC-Lavalin, were squeezing Afghanistan for profits, sucking resources out of that country and back to Bay Street, a couple city blocks away from where I am. Like, that's what was happening in Afghanistan. It was capitalism. It was a predatory form of capitalism, colonial capitalism, justified by the colonial imagination, the story that Canadians told themselves about who they are and who Afghans are. It's the same story, told again and again and again. And I mean, yeah, having awareness of that, I think it helps. I think it's a starting point. But ultimately, I mean, it has to be resisted. It has to be fought. Something has to make the Canadian ruling class stop doing this. And it's not going to be my book. I'm proud of the book, but it's not going to be that.
I know we talked a lot about foreign policy, but early on, you mentioned that this mindset that we're talking about isn't just at the root of how we interact with other nations and Indigenous people, but it's part of our identity. And that makes it even a harder hurdle. So, when I talk to my family and I vent, right? Do you know we do this? Do you know we do that? I'm going to get off here and because I've got more tidbits to enrage people. And it's going to be like, people can't see me. They'll be very skeptical. And you'll see it in their face. Like they don't even want to hear it. But I think there are more and more, and thankfully it's the only good thing that came out of the convoy is a bit of a rejection of this overt nationalism that is, especially that version that is just so steeped in white supremacy, and a rejection even of images like our flag and the poppy. There's more space for that to be normalized, right? Rejecting nationalism altogether, and the discussion of borders and all of that. Like there are definitely cracks there for us to get into and blow up a little bit, proverbially. Forget it, just take that word out. We'll just blow them up. So, you talk a lot about the bad side, though. The statescraft that just does the justification for us in sport. I thought it would be fun to spend a little bit of time on that because I've shared this article with so many people, and it's one Tyler wrote quite a while ago, but I'm going to link it in the show notes. It talks about soccer. He's also talked about hockey. And I think people think Don Cherry right away and the things that he would say to us, and that becomes a little bit more obvious. But can you share with us maybe the less obvious aspects of sport and statescraft that we probably don't question very much?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's, to the question of why are we still today so steeped in the ideology of the colonial imagination and Canadian goodness and Canadian generosity and all these things. Well, I mean, sports is one of the places where I think you get a really good view of how those ideas get reproduced. You're at a sports event, you're there to watch the Blue Jays, and it's a Sunday, and so they're doing the Sunday salute. And so in between innings, they highlight some member of the Canadian military. And
is that a real thing?
It was. I think they've stopped it for now, but for years, yeah. I protested one of them. We did a big protest outside the dome.
You did.
But they would do the Sunday salute, and it would just be, take a moment, everyone, stand, remove your cap, clap if you can, da-da-da-da-da, for Corporal so-and-so who served in this place and that place and this place and whatever. Never any discussion of what happened in those places. Never any discussion of why Canada was there, what Canada was trying to accomplish. Just stop and be thankful, because if you like your life and if you feel good about your life, this member of the Canadian military is what gave you that. And that's
our freedom.
Yeah, right. Your freedom, your democracy, your human rights, everything good came from the military, which is just egregiously false. I mean, you
could say horse shit.
Yeah, absolute fucking horse shit. And I mean, there's a paper trail. I mean, the military never earned individual Canadians any of their civil rights. They were all won through struggle, usually through the union movement, usually through the labor movement. It was labor struggles that gave us almost all the rights we have. And it was always cops and troops that were battling against the labor movement and the working class movement in trying to get those rights in the first place.
I'm going to play that clip on Remembrance Day.
Please do. Please do. It'll get me some hate. It'll get me some hate on Twitter, but I'm used to that by now. Yeah, so, well, I mean, look, World War I. I mean, we talk about briefly World War I. In 1917, Canada is not fighting for freedom and democracy and human rights around the world. It's fighting for the British Empire. And when people in Canada say, you know what, we're sick of dying for the British Empire, quit conscripting us, the Canadian military is brought to Quebec City to open fire on the protesters against conscription. 4 people in Quebec City are murdered by the Canadian military for saying, we don't want to go to Europe and die in a trench. I mean, there's just no way you can argue that the Canadian military was the guarantor of our rights. It was the Canadian military that was trying to stop us from having rights. And yet, flash forward to 2014, and you're enjoying a beer, an overpriced, watery beer at the Sky Dome, and, now you're clapping for some troop who fought in this place and that place and this place and is the reason you have such a good life, right? I mean, that's always how it's framed.
I just want to add a personal anecdote. My husband knows never to let me go to Armed Forces Day at Toronto FC. We used to be season seat holders. And they were usually good games. Like, it was a summer game, usually a weekend game, which we hardly ever got anymore. And it would be like, either it came with a huge disclaimer, like, please, please. I already don't stand for the anthem. So it's just like this awkward kind of, yeah, I'm with her. But Armed Forces Day, he knew I would just be a different level of obnoxious. And it would just better if I maybe missed that game altogether. So I acted skeptical about the Blue Jays. I used to go to the Blue Jays as well quite a bit, but I don't know if I was ever subjected to Salute Sunday, but it's absolutely part of the game, all of them.
Yeah, no, they're all doing it. They're all doing it. And I'm with you, by the way. I always actually try to make sure that I'm in the washroom during the anthems. That's where I like to be.
I should try that.
Yeah, symbolically it feels good.
Awkward.
Yeah, exactly. I don't have to make a scene, and symbolically it feels like the right place to be during that. But yeah, I mean, these things are ubiquitous. They're deeply entrenched in hockey. I mean, hockey right now is in the process of getting rid of all of the promotional events that have anything to do with Indigenous rights, pride, anything progressive at all. But of course, they're holding on to all of their military appreciation stuff. So, I mean,
anything woke.
Anything
Tyler.
woke is out, but the Jets have a new jersey that is directly related to, I don't know, some fighter jet from the 1940s. Like, it's all there, and it's run through so deeply, and it encourages a kind of thoughtless patriotism and thoughtless support for the military. It discourages you from ever actively asking questions about those specific actual events. And I remember it especially with kind of the mantra "support the troops," which we don't hear as much now because Afghanistan has.
I still see the yellow ribbon bumper magnets.
Oh, they're still out there, and they're on every cop car, you can bet. And that support the troops thing was always the narrative was always this. Listen, you may or may not like the mission in Afghanistan. You might have your petty little criticisms of the mission in Afghanistan, but you better support the troops. The troops didn't decide the mission. The troops didn't plot out every element of the mission.
They do can't
The
do
troops
that.
are just out there fighting, putting their life on the line so that you can have a good life, so that you don't have to be over there doing it. And so, that's how...
That's why they break it down to those personal stories,
Exactly.
right? Like, here's Joe, and he went over because he loves being Canadian,
Exactly.
and he wanted to make a better life for the girls of Afghanistan.
Exactly.
That's what he thought, so
Exactly.
we're good.
And so it's designed to make you actively stop asking questions about the conflict itself. And yeah, sports is one place in which that happens. Obviously it's a fruitful, spot for that to happen. And the demographics of sports fans often lends itself to that. I mean, look, there's reasons that sports in particular works, but it happens everywhere. It happens in other elements too.
It's interesting though, because I mean, as a fan of soccer, it's quite the opposite sometimes in other parts of the world. Like, soccer has been a place to organize resistance in many places. So there are many soccer clubs. Celtic comes to mind. Rayo Vallecano in Spain comes to mind, which are openly extremely very left, very and meanwhile the culture here never really adopted such a thing. Like, it's not that sports can't be that, it's more that the culture of sports in the Americas has purposely been designed.
Yeah. And I have an
not
answer
be
for
that.
why I think that is. And I think it has a lot to do with the specific nature of a place like Canada and the United States. And the fact that these are settler colonial states, which is a particular type of state where the working classes, even the working classes in a place like Canada, have bought into colonialism and white supremacy and all of those things, all of those very, very regressive and ruling class ideologies that support the ruling class. You would think, you would hope that working class people could look at something like nationalism and say, hang on a minute, just wait a second. I'm supposed to have deep love for everyone who happens to be born in this place, which includes me and all my friends in my community who are poor, and also the landlord that exploits us, and the boss that exploits us, and the government that exploits us. That doesn't make any fucking sense. You'd think we would be able to do that, and in some places, working classes do actually have that, especially places that have long histories of colonialism, and being on the receiving end of it, I mean. Places that were colonized, they do have working classes that see through that. But in a place like Canada, the working class was always being brought into the ideology of settlerism, of the ruling class. If you think about what is happening when Canada's being established, there's not that many soldiers, there's not that many troops who can carry out the literal genocide and the theft of the land that became Canada. It relied on settlers, individual settlers, doing a lot of the groundwork, literally taking up the farms, taking up the land, right? And holding it down and arming themselves to prevent anyone from taking it back from them. And, a lot of those settlers were initially poor working class people from places like England, which was generating these massive inequalities in capitalism, creating these, oppressed working classes, and then promising them a ticket out of the working class by giving them space on a boat and a piece of land in Canada. And all of a sudden, people who were in the working class now have an emotional and political investment in the idea of Canada, because that's going to be their way to a better life. And the only thing between me, the settler, and this better life is all these Indigenous people who are saying I can't actually have the land. I mean, right there you have the construction of a type of working class that's going to be reactionary. Not every single person, not every single time, but in its overall political sort of orientation, a settler working class views itself as kind of wrapped up in the settler project. That's how Canada's formed. So if you think about that class of settler and the ideology that they have, which they teach to their kids, who teach it to their kids and to their kids, and you kind of start to see why, even all these generations later, there isn't the same kind of anti-capitalist anti-colonial working class movements that might, build a more radical politics around their local sports team, right? Which is super cool when it happens. And it does happen in other parts of the world, but it just doesn't here. Most of the Canadian working class views itself as a temporarily disgraced member of the bourgeoisie, right? Just waiting for the crypto boom or whatever it is that's going to pull them into the comfortable middle class life that they are entitled to, and happy to blame someone else other than the ruling class for their problems, right? You have a working class in Canada that is very quick to blame whether it's Muslims, whether it's Asians, whether it's gays and lesbians and trans kids. I mean, whoever. Find someone to blame so that I don't have to blame, the government and the banks and the owners of these big companies and Canada itself. So it is.
That part's so essential. That's what keeps it together. It makes me think of I was just up Thanksgiving, when you have those conversations, and I was thinking about that exact kind of train of thought, because I was hearing people start to blame different groups for different things, and I was trying to get them to realize that point. And it's interesting because when you don't try and argue against what they're arguing, but you try and redirect them to who they're actually supposed to blame, to the ruling class, most of the time in my experience, people are actually quite open to that. They're just not exposed to that many of those arguments. It's not typically what they think of. But when you tell them, hey, why are you blaming, you think Indigenous people are trying to get ahead, take advantage of residential school treatment to get ahead. Why are you blaming them for this? Why are you focusing on them when there's this whole ruling class that's getting away like bandits? And then that
because it's logical, it's rational. I mean, it right? makes sense. If we weren't so hoodwinked by the colonial fucking imagination, then we'd be in a much better position to build a working class movement, right? And because it's all pretty obvious. Galen Weston is the enemy. I mean, Galen Weston is the problem. And he's the problem for most people in the working class, regardless of their race, regardless of their gender or sexuality. Galen Weston is still going to be the problem. And, it's in Galen Weston's interest to make sure that we don't think that way. Right? I mean, that's a big part of ruling class ideology, is to keep the working classes divided. And obviously, in a settler society like Canada, racism is one of the best ways to do it, and always has been. So, yeah, I mean, again, big challenges here, right? In terms of thinking about how do we push back against all of this, identifying it, being aware of it, this all helps, but there's also just a huge amount of groundwork to do, direct action to take, movements to organize, to directly push back against these things. And that can feel daunting somewhere like Canada, where there isn't a lot of it, but I always do try to at the very least point people in the direction of Indigenous struggles, because any pushback against the Canadian state, the state apparatus, the thing that is Canada that keeps us perpetually locked into all of this shit, Indigenous movements are positioned to directly confront the Canadian state. They view themselves as having been colonized by the Canadian state. They view the Canadian state as their principal antagonist, correctly, I think. And they are willing to confront the Canadian state directly on these things. So I do think that any kind of revolutionary project in Canada has to be rooted in those Indigenous struggles. And for the rest of us who are not Indigenous, I think a really good place to start is doing direct solidarity work with those Indigenous struggles.
Speaking of Indigenous struggles, I think perhaps this colonial imagination and the settler mindset is a huge barrier in Palestinian solidarity right now. And I couldn't help but think of that, especially when you described how the RCMP and the Canadian government would rely on settlers to do the job of colonialism. We see that particularly in the West Bank, where it's not necessarily IDF soldiers, although they may help clear the way, but that settlers take that really active role, and that mindset is very deep there. And so it's no wonder that even perhaps we do have material interest in Israel continuing its apartheid, but there's a real ideological need to prop that up, that model, because it's so identical to what you described there. And that was one of the questions I wanted to ask you, but you, in a roundabout way, ended up answering it, I think, for us. I don't, if you want to add to that as well, just to help us understand, because like the last episode we did, Santiago and I were struggling. It feels like the Twilight Zone, where, like you said, most people understand what is happening at the hands of the state of Israel, and they support Indigenous resistance. So I'm not talking about the far right. Like, I'm talking about people who, some of our comrades, who understand the need for Indigenous resistance. They understand the detriments of colonialization, but yet are really struggling with this particular issue and remaining standing for Palestine.
Yeah. I mean, I think you got it. You nailed it. Like, it is the absolutely sort of parallel foundation of Israel, parallel to Canada. That is, the establishment of a settler colonial state in many of the same ways. And by the way, with Canadian assistance. Canada played an active role in that process in the 1940s. And I think that is precisely what, at a deep sort of almost psychological level, is a roadblock for a lot of Canadians who might otherwise offer a more full-throated solidarity for Palestine, because Israel is a slightly, modernized version of precisely the same thing Canada was. It's a settler colonial state. And if the world got together and said, okay, we're done with settler colonialism, this is fucked, you can't do this anymore, then what would that mean for Canada?
Yes, please.
Right? What would that, I mean, if Palestine...
That scares people.
It does. Because if Palestine got its freedom, then you have essentially the basis for Indigenous people here gaining their freedom and the actual decolonization of Canada, which, look, a lot of people on, certainly a lot of liberals, but even, a lot of leftists may talk big about decolonize this, decolonize your mind, decolonize the school.
Land back.
Right, yeah.
But they don't mean it.
They don't mean it. And when push comes to shove, the actual concrete idea of this land becoming Indigenous sovereign territory terrifies them, just as it terrifies Israeli settlers, who are indeed, as you said, the vanguard of Israeli colonialism. So, I mean, I think that's part of the stumbling block. And again, it comes back to the deep DNA of Canada, of what Canada is and what Canadian settlers were and by extension are. And, to your point earlier, Santiago, we keep coming back to it, but it's an important one about the perception of Canada elsewhere. And certainly, if we think about what does it mean to be an immigrant, a more recent immigrant in Canada, someone who's come to Canada in the last 50 years, let's say, and holds a lot of those views. Oh, Canada is a place of hope, a place of possibility. Look what it's given us, et cetera, et cetera. I'm obviously more sympathetic in a lot of those cases because there's obviously usually reasons why people were looking for a place of hope. Canada, by the way, is often the reason. I mean, Canada participates in creating a crisis in Chile, and then so generously allows Chilean immigrants, refugees from Pinochet's Chile, even as Canada supporting Pinochet. So, right, but nevertheless,
we can say the same about Ukraine.
Yeah. Totally, obviously, right? And so many.
Tyler's got a list.
I got a list. Yeah, I don't even want to start myself because
those pin in a map, and it would
right,
just be
exactly,
full.
Yeah. So you can understand why people in some cases will see Canada as having offered them refuge, and a better and better possibilities, even if that didn't end up being true. But that, as much as I may have some sympathy for it, that still can replicate some of the same settler colonial ideologies, right? At some level, as people become, for one reason or another, as people become emotionally and politically invested in the Canadian state, they're becoming emotionally and politically invested in a state that's founded on genocide and conquest and that doesn't have a legitimate right to the land it uses.
Mm-hmm. And it's a really difficult thing for somebody to accept, because, this idea of, like, all of those hopes and dreams, the idea of the Canadian dream, to actually accept that was wrong and that maybe it was even a mistake. I mean, like, in certain cases, there are situations now where countries where people have come from are now doing better. Life there is better than it is in Canada. And to have lost, your homeland and to now be here, and it's a difficult thing to accept. And people find a lot of, like, it creates that cognitive dissonance where people find a lot of other things to blame instead of accepting that.
Totally, it is.
It's incredibly painful.
And like I say, right, and these are cases where I'm a lot more sympathetic. I can understand some of the reasons for that dissonance, and so I have a lot more empathy in those cases, as opposed to, say, just, descendant of white settlers who just wants to wave the flag and whatever. But one thing that I think, when we're having conversations, with people in those situations, one thing that I find helpful is to remember that, in truth, a decolonized Canada would almost definitely provide a better life for most people. Canada, as it stands, does not provide a good life for most people, and it especially doesn't provide a good life for most immigrants, for most people of color. It doesn't follow through on the promises that it makes, and you're kind of saying that. A decolonized Canada, where Amazon isn't allowed to exploit your labor, where you don't have to work at Tim Hortons in order to survive, where you are not at the absolute mercy of a predatory landlord for the very roof over your head, where you can't be evicted and kicked out because that landlord wants to rent, so-called renovate and bump the rent by $1,000. That's a better world. That's a better life for most people. And when I think about it in those terms, I am perfectly willing to roll the dice on a non-capitalist indigenous society and put my faith in the fact that if I am in solidarity with that struggle, if I try to participate in the building of that world, that I too will have a better life from it than the one that Canada offers me now. Canada does not offer us very much. But of course, naturally, and this is always a roadblock to revolution, people are afraid to lose the little bit they have. The little bit I have is, at least it's secure.
The devil you know.
Yeah, the devil you know. I don't want to roll the dice on, and I get that. That's fair. Revolution is not a tea party. It's not a picnic. But I do think fundamentally we all except the very rich and the very racist. If you're among the very rich and the very racist, yeah, it's going to be bad. It's going to be bad.
You're not going to have any fun in the new world.
Land back is not going to be your cup of tea. But outside of the very rich and the very racist, I think we all stand to gain from land back. We all stand to gain from a decolonized Canada where some of the worst things about this place, the most predatory, exploitative things about this place, are no longer in place. I mean, I'm willing to roll the dice on that.
Well, we're going to end it on that positive note, because I usually try to wait for one, right? We can't end on a downer. Now we just need the blueprints of decolonization. Don't worry, Tyler, we're not going to quiz you on that right now. That's a process. We know that. But thank you for coming in today and giving us all kinds of tidbits that really did drive that point home on how invasive colonialism is, not just with the Indigenous populations here in Canada, but in what we thought was our very rosy foreign policy. Well, we didn't. Our audience is a little more intelligent than that, but they're going to have a whole lot of stories that they can bring back to their families next Thanksgiving or at Christmas and just like, you bet you didn't know this part of Canadian history. So if enough people keep telling these stories, they will be woven in and we can start to kind of break that armor down. Thank you so much, Tyler, for your time and all of your work. And I will be sure to link the audience back to a ton of it. That is a wrap on another episode of Blueprints of Disruption. Thank you for joining us. Also, a very big thank you to the producer of our show, Santiago Halu Quintero. Blueprints of Disruption is an independent production operated cooperatively. You can follow us on Twitter at BP of Disruption. If you'd like to help us continue disrupting the status quo, please share our content, and if you have the means, consider becoming a patron. Not only does our support come from the progressive community, so does our content. So reach out to us and let us know what or who we should be amplifying. So until next time, keep disrupting.